So, welcome everybody. I'm Dr. Greta Werner. I'm a postdoctoral researcher with the Henry Halloran Research Trust here at the University of Sydney, and I am very happy to be chairing this event today. But before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land that we're on today, and I'd like to pay my respects to First Nations people, past, present, First Nations leaders, past, present, and emerging, and would like to extend our respects to any First Nations people here today and watching online. So the Henry Halloran Research Trust here at the University of Sydney fosters research and dialogue across cities and regions, about cities and regions between academics, policymakers, practitioners, and, of course, the wider community. Housing has been a particular theme for many of the researchers and events that we've supported, and tonight we have two very special talks on housing. The first being delivered by visiting scholar Dr. Rowan Arundel on the global inequalities occurring worldwide due to the spatial polarisation of housing markets and implications for access to wealth. And the second, a discussion in celebration of our former Henry Halloran Research Trust postdoctoral scholar, Dr. Cameron Murray's recent published book, The Great Housing Hijack. We're going to start our event tonight with Dr. Arundel's lecture before breaking for a reception at 6 and then moving in at around 6:35 for a reading and conversation around the themes of Cameron's book, with special guest star Professor Peter Phibbs. Hooray! Who will be known to many of you. So I know some of you will want to leave at 6, but we are, of course, you're welcome to stay for both events as well. Now, let me introduce Dr. Arundel. Dr. Rowan Arundel is Assistant Professor in Geographic Information Science in the Department of Geography, Planning and International Development at the University of Amsterdam. His interests cover many areas of urban geography, planning and housing studies with a focus on dynamics of housing inequality and interactions between housing, labour and welfare. He is the recipient of a prestigious fellowship for his project, Wealthscapes, the spatial inequality of housing wealth accumulation, which looks at the Netherlands, UK and Spain to confront the crucial role of housing markets in driving wealth inequalities. Dr. Arundel will speak for about 30 minutes and then there'll be an opportunity for questions before we break for the reception at 6. So without further ado, Rowan Arundel, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Oh, fantastic. Thanks for having me here. I hope everybody can hear me, and it's a decent volume and not too loud, not too quiet, just holler if it is. Yeah, well, I'm happy to be able to join you here today and present some of my research. Thanks for the introduction. I am indeed visiting here from the University of Amsterdam. I'm Canadian originally, that's why this isn't really a Dutch accent, but I'm here in Australia for a few events, for a housing conference in Adelaide, for this talk here, and doing some work together at the University of Sydney, and this is a very nice opportunity to come and kind of present the work that I'm doing. Even though it will be Europe-focused in many ways, I think elements will hopefully resonate because these are issues that are happening across many countries. I'm going to introduce my general kind of research focus, what I usually work on. I'll then introduce the Wealthscapes project that I'm going to talk about today, and I'll look at some research that has been completed on the Netherlands as an example, and preliminary kind of fresh results from work on Spain as well. They might seem like random two countries, but I think they're informative in kind of explaining this process of what I'm going to be talking about. And then I'll try to wrap it together. Generally, my research has focused, a little bit of an introduction there that was helpful. My research has focused, as you know, on housing inequalities, broadly speaking, many different dimensions of them. I would say that, yeah, no problem. Okay, thought it was the volume thing. The one side of kind of my research has focused on housing outcomes, or housing as it reflects and amplifies, and you'll see I'll talk about how I see housing amplifying other inequalities, and we could talk about wealth inequalities, intergenerational inequalities, so between younger and older populations, and among those cohorts, labor market inequalities, how they're reflected in the housing market, and spatial inequalities. And today, I'll bring back the spatial element a lot as well. And on the flip side, I focus a lot on kind of drivers, what's been promoting, in other work I've done, what's been promoting this increasing housing inequality. And there's a broad set of drivers. And I've looked at kind of elements of financialization, commodification. These are broad terms, but what does that mean of the housing market? Comparatively across different countries to understand how different housing markets and welfare regimes and housing systems impact them. Processes of welfare restructuring and how housing has been implicated in that. So that's kind of the broad focus of my research. Some kind of recent work, just to give you an idea. Some of you might have been here a couple of weeks ago and seen my colleague, Professor Richard Ronald, who is here also from the same institute. So we're having many, apparently, Dutch people coming for this season. But I've worked a lot with him together. And so, for example, we've worked on this paper, The False Promise of Homeownership, where we looked at how has homeownership been promoted over the decades in terms of something that is kind of equalizing or inclusive as a social project of homeownership, and how has that been undermined in recent decades. Or other work I've done together with researchers in Australia. So this is Emma Bakers at the University of Adelaide and Rebecca Bentley and Ang Lee at the University of Melbourne, looking at kind of outcomes. So how does being in affordability stress, in this case, impact reported mental health and well-being? And in this paper, we looked at the Netherlands, but compared it to research they've done in Australia to understand how different housing systems might moderate that or temper that. And maybe Richard Ronald already plugged this book. I'm not going to plug it much, but this is a recent one co-edited with him that looks at the changing role of families across generations and how they mobilize around trying to accumulate housing assets in a world of increasing risk and an increasing kind of asset-based economy, let's say, or individualized risk where people rely on assets, which means generally housing. So that's kind of the background, and I want to jump to the main focus, and that is working on all these elements of kind of housing inequality. I have to admit, I'm also a geographer, and I have a very kind of spatial perspective as well. And as well as that kind of an interest in understanding how does space play a role in these kind of large scale, so macro scale dynamics of inequality, of housing inequality. And I'll introduce a little bit more, but that's where this project comes from, the Wealthscapes project. So we can think about it in terms of a context, unsurprisingly, that we're all familiar with, of rising inequalities across many countries across several decades. A lot of attention has been placed on rising income inequality, and that's just kind of an easy snapshot of the top 10% incomes across OECD countries, all of them, together with the bottom 10% over this period. We can see these diverging income inequalities, and a lot of attention has been focused on that. However, I would argue, along with others, that wealth is much more significant over the longer term. So yes, income is essential for our ongoing day-to-day financial capacity. I'm not trying to undermine that. But over the long term, it is wealth that is transferred across generations. And beyond that, wealth is also much more unequal than income. So this is, I didn't put a year there, but I think it's 2018. It wouldn't look very different if we looked at it right now, just slightly worse. And this is the top 10% of wealth versus a very negligible amount of the bottom 10% across all OECD countries here, which is a large collection of kind of high or advanced economic countries, let's say. Now, the premise of the Wealthscapes project, kind of from that context, is that when we're talking about wealth, I call this premise one, when we're talking about wealth, we really mean housing for the vast majority of households. So yes, if you're the top 0.001%, that group will have a significant share of stocks or business holdings, if we look at that. But if we look at the bulk of kind of the middle range of people, or the majority of households, housing is their source of asset accumulation. And it's a different set of countries, the EU 15 countries, but it would be similar across a lot of them. This is looking at where do average household assets and housing clearly stands out. The second premise is that housing is a special asset. So it's different than just bank savings or stocks or diversified portfolio of savings because it is inherently spatially fixed, right? And this is where kind of my argument of where space plays a role. You don't buy into little bits of housing everywhere, most people. I mean, there are real estate investment trusts, but most people buy into a house that they're going to live in or maybe a secondary property, and these are in special or spatially fixed locations, I want to say. So we're not talking about a singular housing market when we talk about national housing markets or regional housing markets, even though that's often the discourse that we see. We're talking about these very spatially distinct housing markets. And simply, where one enters the housing market is key for wealth accumulation. That's the second premise. And I get to cheat and say there's a second part of the second premise, and that is that there are hints, there's indications, at least kind of when I started this project, that this differentiation across space is intensifying. All right. So we know that housing markets are not flat. There are more expensive areas and cheaper areas. We know there's areas that have gained more, areas that have gained less. We can think of hot and cold markets. It's always going to be uneven. But the question here is, has it intensified? Has the spatial polarization intensified? And there's some evidence from literature looking at kind of broadly financialization, commodification of housing markets that has argued that there's increased, or measured at least that there's increased flows of capital into housing markets, and argued that these have become increasingly uneven, that have concentrated in certain kind of prime markets that we can think of, certain prime cities or certain areas of prime cities versus larger regions of stagnation or small growth or shrinking. We can think of theories of uneven development, work by Neil Brenner, for example, looking at over many decades how areas that are already booming have been prioritized for economic development as well as policy, and that has intensified these uneven developments. And we can think of a whole body of research looking within cities on dynamics such as segregation and gentrification. And this is a bit less clear of how that might play out in terms of spatial inequality. Maybe gentrification actually cancels out to some extent the spatial inequality, has its other problems. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm saying in terms of spatial inequality. So we have these different kind of hints at potentially increasing spatial polarization, but surprisingly there isn't, or there wasn't when I was starting this detailed analysis of understanding what's happening across housing markets in terms of spatial inequality. The third premise is simply that access to housing is unequal and that is becoming more unequal, and that has been the bulk of my previous research before this, looking at the access of entry into homeownership. We see across many economies rising labor market inequality, rising precarity among certain younger cohorts, but also not only intergenerational, but also intragenerational inequality. And this has meant that labor market position and parental wealth increasingly central to structuring access to the housing market. So I'm bringing those three premises together. We can, hopefully you haven't lost track of where I was, and that is the centrality of housing to wealth and inequality, the fact that housing is inherently spatially fixed, and that spatial polarization that exists across the landscape of housing markets has potentially become more polarized, and that access to housing is divided. And that is kind of the motivating question there of how does the spatial polarization of housing markets interact with dividing housing access in, I could write, potentially driving growing wealth inequalities. That's a microphone. That's the motivating question there behind the project. The project looks at three countries. You already kind of heard the hint about them. It's the Netherlands, Spain, the UK. You saw I didn't mention the UK in my outline. I'm working on it. We're not going to talk about the UK today. So Brexit happened as well from this project. It'll return later, but it's just going to be the Netherlands and Spain. The three things that I'm focusing on this project is first measuring, understanding what is that spatial polarization. Is it happening? The second is explaining the spatial polarization. It's faded out because I'm not going to talk about that today. I get to choose what I'm talking about. The third one is modeling that divided access is the focus, so understanding the divided access in housing. So I'm going to focus really on those two, and hopefully this diagram makes it more clear and not less clear. We can think of the housing market, as I argued, as not one singular thing, but we have housing submarkets across countries, territories. Some are hot, some are cold, right? Some are gaining a lot, some are not. So that's that part there. I probably have this little thing. There we go. Very hard to see, but there was a little laser pointer. Okay. You know what I'm talking about. that is the idea that there's division across housing submarkets. And of course, if you enter or you hold housing assets in a hot market, you're going to have much higher wealth accumulation. If you hold it in a stagnating, shrinking, or slow growth one, you'll have lower wealth accumulation. The next part of the question is, do households sort out into those areas based on their socioeconomic position and also parental resources that might assist that? Now, if households randomly sorted across different gains, it wouldn't impact, the housing market wouldn't have any additional effect. And what I'm talking about here is not that wealthier households buy more expensive housing. That's obvious. What I'm talking about is, do wealthier or higher income or higher socioeconomic status households buy in areas where their money is accruing more quickly, right? The rate. And that is the key element here. The first study that I'm going to present is work that's been completed on the Netherlands, together with my colleague Cody Hoxenbach at the University of Amsterdam. And there are a couple publications on it, and I'll just give some of the key elements. So it looks at the Netherlands. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the Dutch case, but just kind of an overview. Interesting thing is, up until the mid-1990s, it was minority homeownership, majority renter. That grew very rapidly relative to most countries there over about a 15-year period to 20 years into a majority homeownership and reaching about mid-2010s, about 60%, close 60%, and it stayed around that level ever since. So that means 60% of households are engaged investing in homeownership. It actually means more if we look over the entire life course, because that's a snapshot. But as people age, more enter homeownership, so it's probably around 70% of households if you looked at it considering cohort trends. We saw rapid growth in house prices over long term, like many other countries, except for a global financial crisis dip. Highly financialized housing market, the highest mortgage debt to GDP ratio in Europe, policies that have privileged homeownership, but it is also famous for having, some of you might know, the largest social housing sector in Europe and across Western countries, you could say. There are a few exceptions of other places that are similar. But that has seen gradual declines, which has kind of eroded alternatives. So yes, there's a stock of protected people that live in social housing, but entering it is very difficult. So a lot of people have flowed into homeownership and saved and invested in homeownership. Very usefully, it also provides a very detailed data set, which I will talk about now, which is in the Netherlands, there is a full register data set that includes full population and every dwelling, so every individual and every dwelling registered in the country. It's longitudinal, it's geolocated, we have the geographic location at a defined scale, and from that, we were able to generate across a detailed spatial units, neighborhoods, the inflation adjustment rates of housing wealth accumulation per neighborhood. And there are a few years of delay before you can get the data. When we were doing this, we could get up to 2018, so it's pre-COVID, but we'll look at more recent data also with Spain. And what we're able to do there is look at each neighborhood, take all the units that are in it, all of them have values, get rid of all new built ones and all demolished ones, and we have a stable stock over our entire period, and track the value of those units, which tells us the value of that area's, the rates of change of that area. And we end up with about just over 11,000 neighborhoods and just under 6 million dwellings in our data set. So the first thing we can do is look at that part. To what extent do we see spatial polarization? And now I'm going to show you a map. This is the warning slide that I'm going to show you a map. This map might look a little bit weird. It is the Netherlands. Some of you might be familiar with the country of the Netherlands. If you're not, then you'll feel more comfortable looking at this map. It has been distorted intentionally because I've distorted all the neighborhoods based on their number of dwellings. It's called a cartogram. So it's a cartogram showing all that data crunched into one little map. And what is it showing? It's showing the change in inflation adjustment house values, so the rates and percentages there, across all the neighborhoods across the country. Right? The neighborhoods is an official statistical unit that covers city neighborhoods that we think of, as well as rural landscape, in between the towns, small villages. And we can see the first thing that we see from this map is that we're not talking about a national housing market. If we look at the accumulation of housing wealth over this period of 12 years, we see that large areas of the country remained shrinking below, lost value in those areas. Some areas stagnated, but really we're talking about some areas, this being Amsterdam, if you can read it from there, capturing a large amount, and not all of Amsterdam, but parts of it, of housing value, and some other places, Utrecht being a secondary city, parts of The Hague, Rotterdam, not important exactly where, but specific areas that have captured housing wealth. It is important where, but not in our time for now. If we look at just the recovery period, and this is the last period in our data set that we're looking at, which was framed as a kind of period of national recovery of the housing market post-global financial crisis. We can also say large areas saw slight gains, some areas didn't, but really, even more so, most of the housing wealth over the recovery period was concentrated and captured by the capital city there, Amsterdam, those holding housing assets in the capital city. This then is our direct measuring of the spatial inequality. So I'll just kind of talk you through what we're looking at here. This is looking at neighborhood level housing market inequality. So the inequality in terms of across the neighborhoods in values. The blue line is important to start with. It's showing us, for reference, the house values across the whole country, how they've changed, and have standardized everything to 100 at the beginning of our data set. What we see is that we're capturing, it's only 12 years, but we're capturing a lot of diversity in the housing market. We have a boom period pre-global financial crisis. We have the large crash of the global financial crisis. We have as well the recovery period. We then look at the spatial inequality using a Gini measure, which is a common measure of inequality. And for those that are familiar, you know what it is. For those that don't, basically, you can use this measure to look at the distribution, how equal the distribution is. 0, absolute equality. Everything is sharing the same value. In this case, it would be all neighborhoods are sharing the same wealth, housing wealth, value. And 1 or 100, depends on your scale, absolute inequality. One place captures all of it. So if it's income, everybody has the same amount of income. If it's one maximum, one person has all the income. So going up means more unequal, simply put. And what we can see is there is indeed a clear increase in spatial inequality. This is not something that's necessarily taken for granted. We know the landscape of housing market is unequal, but we didn't know whether it has become more polarized. So that was the first goal of doing this analysis of the big data set. The second thing that we do see, which is very interesting, is that even in periods of this intense, for example, bust period of the global financial crisis, we don't see a correction of the spatial inequality. We see it stagnating for part of that period, but we don't see it correcting. And that is something that there are assumptions, maybe from kind of more of a classical economic assumption, that areas that were inflated, that were kind of housing bubbles, would have crashed more, and we might have seen a correction of that. We don't see a correction. We see it continuing, although stagnating, but staying at that same level of inequality, and then increasing again, clearly. So that's a very kind of stark finding of a clear trend towards increasing inequality. Now, the 90-10 ratio just means the top 10% of most expensive areas versus the bottom 10%. I should say that they're weighted by number of dwellings, so that is based on the top 10% of dwellings in those areas. And the 95-5 is the 5 most expensive ratio to the bottom 5. And those are tracking similarly the pattern of increasing inequality, just another measure. Now, that's the first finding. Yes, we do see that increasing inequality. The second part, to understand how does the population sort across this. And here we're able to turn to that big data set as well, track all these households. And I'm not going to go into the details of the data, but we run a regression analysis, multi-level regression analysis. We look at our samples, all young starters entering the housing market, and we want to see, are they entering higher or lower gain areas, and what kind of characteristics correlate with that. So we look at characteristics like income, employment contract type of the households. In the data set, we're able to link all parents to all children, to all families. So we can't look at the actual transfers, but we can see the wealth of the parents. And we have a lot of important controls: education, ethnicity, marital status, children, number of siblings. And it looks like this, and I'm not going to look through that. But you can enjoy that table all you want if you want to look at the paper and look at the details of it. But I want to get to the key findings that are important. And what do we see? We find a significant correlation between those having higher income and buying into higher gain neighborhoods. So it isn't that people Could be that it's becoming more divided, but people are randomly sorting across it. But no, we see that those that have, there's a clear effect as well, and it's a significant effect, that those that are higher income, households are higher income, are buying into areas that are higher gain. We also see an additional effect beyond that of higher education level. And that means that those households that have higher socioeconomic status, of course they're putting more money into the housing market likely, but also for each, in this case, euro that they're putting in, they're seeing higher rates of gain relative to those that are buyers that are lower income. We see an additional impact of parental wealth. So that's an additional impact showing buying into higher gains. And in terms of that, we also see when we look in more analysis that it seems more liquid parental wealth, non-housing wealth, has a higher impact. The number of siblings moderates that impact, tampers it a little bit. So it's likely showing an additional impact of helping financially, which allows them to buy into higher gain neighborhoods. That was the end. Okay, that was the end of the Dutch one. That was the segue. But here we go to Spain. And then I'll tie it together. I'll go through Spain a little bit more quickly. But we wanted to look at a second case that was a large other country context. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of this, but it's the key point there is a very high homeownership rate in Spain at about 80% over many decades. Now it has gone down a little bit to around 76%, 77% depending on your measure, so in the 2020s. But of course, over the full life course, that would be even higher. And so it means a majority of households there are interacting with the housing market, investing, putting assets into it. And what is happening? So we have a very different, we'll skip some of that, but we have a very different type of data set here because we don't have access to this amazingly detailed official register data set in the Spanish case. So we had to rely on this private data set, Idealista, which is a listing company. Like I think you have realestate.com or domain or something here. So something similar. It captures a vast majority of it. And we can get functional data from 2012 to 2022. We look at census tract levels, which are similar, kind of analogous to the neighborhood. So we can do a useful comparison, neighborhood in the Netherlands, so a useful comparison. And we get most territorial coverage, and we can interpolate some of those extra missing gaps in the area with some GIS analysis. So we get inflation-adjusted rates of housing wealth accumulation per census tract. All right. So there's a little bit more limitations on this data set. It's not as perfect, but it still tells us a lot. We then try to repeat these analyses to understand them. Again, we can't use slight difference. We can't use number of dwellings, but we use population, which is very correlated. And we then get another even weirder map. This is a bit traumatizing for anybody who is from Spain. But the Spanish case has a lot more uneven population distribution, so it gets much more distorted. Of course, here's the actual Spanish map. But if we do an actual map like this, we hide all the important places where the housing market is concentrated, right? Luckily, I don't have Australia on here, it'd be even worse, or Canada, where I'm from. So, good. No revolts in the room. But we have here the map, and what do we see again? Over this decade, it's again a story where this is not where expensive houses are, this is the rates of accumulation. And what we see here is that it's definitely concentrated much higher rates in certain areas, big cities, some touristic zones in the Spanish case, for example, and other large areas that have stagnated or very small increases. So we're able to repeat this analysis in the Spanish case, and what do we see? Well, first looking at the blue line there, it's a slightly different shifted, it's more recent data set, but we capture the decline of the global financial crisis, continuing decline, in the Spanish case turning around in about 2016. Clear recovery. 2020, we're able to capture the peak year of the pandemic and the pandemic restrictions, particularly in the Spanish case, and then late COVID or post-COVID, whatever you want to call it, recovery period there happening afterwards. But if we look at the Gini value, measuring inequality, even more starkly increasing, as we can see. So it's gone up by 25%. Small changes, for those that work with Gini, small changes are usually pretty significant in terms of the distribution of wealth. So here we see that spatial polarization clearly intensifying. And again, importantly, perhaps some stagnation here in these ratio ones, but Gini less, which is a better measure. Even in a period of decline, we see increasing spatial inequality. A small pause, perhaps, in 2020, or a little bit delayed, but continuing after that. So it's an important, clear indication of this increasing spatial divide that we have in the housing markets and where people are holding their housing wealth. This one I have to quickly explain, but with the Spanish data, I'm not able to track populations. We don't have that population amazing data set. So what I can do here, and I'll explain it, is I've sorted all the areas, the census tract, based on, so in deciles, the lowest value, you can think of as the cheapest areas, to the most expensive 10%. Okay, that's how we've sorted it at the beginning of the data set. That's not what I wanted to do. You were just getting used to that. And we can look first at the green, absolute change, okay, by square meter here to kind of standardize it. So the first thing we can see is that those areas the most expensive saw the highest increase in value. And that's not so surprising. It's a bit intuitive. An area that's more expensive might have gone up by more in absolute value. But it also is significant in what it means. It also means, if we think about it, kind of what it means underlying that is that over that decade, a huge share of the increase in housing wealth concentrated in those 10% most expensive areas. Right. So that's where a vast majority of all the housing wealth over that 10 years across all of Spain concentrated. The other thing that we see is that the pink one, which is perhaps more important, I was trying to use this, but I'll forget it. The pink one, which is perhaps more important in terms of understanding what it means as a mechanism, it's looking at the percentage change. So we have a weird exception that probably a lot of you noticed. In the cheapest 10% of areas, we see a higher rate. It's at about the average, right? It's a bit of an exception there. Something we're looking into too. It's probably that they're kind of unique areas that are the most cheap areas that might have had more chance to change. But at the same time, we have to remember as an absolute amount, because they're the cheapest, it's not a huge amount in absolute. But if we look at the rest of the pattern, what we see is very clearly the rates are much higher in the most expensive areas. So this is, again, the most expensive 10%. The areas at the beginning of the data set saw about twice the rate of housing wealth accumulation than the average across the country. So we don't have information about the people sorting, but we know, of course, that those that have higher financial capacity are buying into the more expensive areas. So it also indicates a similar pattern indirectly of what we saw in the Dutch case. Now, I'm going to wrap it up, bring it together, hopefully. The main point here is that housing wealth accumulation has become more spatially uneven. Now, we have two cases here. I'm working on the UK case. There are vague indications across other countries that look at just capital cities versus the national average, showing these changes in terms of that. But I really need detailed data to be able to robustly show this, and I'm able to show that in these two cases. We can see housing wealth is concentrated in specific areas of prime accumulation, and these rates are much higher there, versus areas that are generally stagnating. That these trends are structural, granted over a relatively short period, but still a period with a lot of housing market volatility and diversity. And these are, to some extent, crisis resistant. They're not correcting, they're just slowing or stagnating during that period. I didn't talk about the different scales, but I looked at differences also between municipalities, differences among major municipalities. All of them show trends for these two countries of increasing spatial inequality. And I wouldn't be surprised if we'd see it in many other ones. So the argument here is that space matters, not just reflecting, but as an active driver of housing wealth inequality. Because of housing being a special asset that is spatially fixed, you're parking your money in a certain housing market that is influenced primarily by its spatial locale. And if you take that together with barriers of access, that you're buying into one large asset, you're not buying little chunks dispersed in other places, that of course these come together. So spatial inequality and accumulation combined with unequal access to drive as a mechanism, as an engine of increasing housing wealth inequality over time. And this is not just kind of trivial, it could have a very significant impact if we think of just the headline of the Spanish case that the most expensive 10% of areas have double the rate of accumulation over that 10 years than the average. And many areas had much lower. In the Dutch case, we can clearly measure these type of things with the data set that looks how socioeconomic status sorts out into higher gain areas, higher income. And in the Spanish case, we have this indication of it based on differentiated rates for cheaper and more expensive areas. And my final point there in terms of these conclusions is that beyond just thinking of the dichotomy of kind of accessing homeownership, beyond the dichotomy of homeowners versus non-owners or long-term renters, something that I mostly worked on in the past, it's important to understand the divides among homeowners as well. The majority of the population is putting their assets into the housing market. We have to understand how that generates increasing divides. That's my takeaway, that wealth inequalities are not only mapped onto space, but space itself figures prominently in reproducing, and as I argue here, amplifying such inequalities. And that's the end. Thank you.
Fantastic and right on time. Great timing. So we've received some questions from the audience.
Magically.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Just to encourage you to next time put a question when you register. I'm just going to give this one a priority. So the question is, will rising wages increase or ease or fuel the current property crisis? And this question is from Ronaldo. Thank you, Ronaldo.
Okay. So it's a question before they saw the presentation.
It is beforehand, yes.
Because it fully answered, no, it didn't fully answer it. Will rising wages solve the housing crisis? I mean, what I'm focused on is inequality, and I think at the root of the housing crisis is inequality, the fact that housing values increase tremendously for a small proportion, or sometimes it could be a more significant proportion of the society, depending on the country, and others are shut out from that, and that creates incentives to maintain the inflated value of housing, while often in many countries, younger cohorts are not able to enter it, or those that don't have parental resources that can help them out, or from other areas that move into a city, for example. That's kind of the broader story. So rising wages, it's not about rising wages overall, it's about a redistribution of economic capacity that could help that. But it can't only be solved by wages because so much wealth is already accumulated in the housing market. And so we need policies, of course, that help to temper the speculation and allow some redistribution, there's many different versions, whether we capture it through capital gains tax or other elements that helps redistribute some of that housing wealth. And then my presentation here, as you might have pointed out, as you might have noticed, brings in that extra dimension of space that we also have to consider how it's not a singular housing market, but we have these concentrated areas of intense accumulation that become kind of enclaves of rapid housing wealth growth, which means that, of course, people are even more shut out from those specific enclaves where the most amount of growth has happened. And you might already be thinking that flows of population also drive that wealth increase, and that's true. So if you are thinking that, yes, they are interacting, the causality is not just in one direction, that indeed flows of people with more money entering a certain housing market drives increasing value of that housing market, they're bringing in more money, and that brings the value up, and it might also make it more attractive. So I don't see that as a problem in terms of describing the analysis, I see that as an extra element that they become kind of a vicious cycle of increasing rates of accumulation. So I started by answering it, and then I drifted off in the direction I wanted to go.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay, so I've seen a couple of people have got questions. Maybe over here first, and then we'll go to this side of the room.
Thanks so much for your... G'day, John Brockhoff from the Planning Institute. I'm really curious about your maps and the extent to which they're an expression of the capitalisation of amenity in the Netherlands. Clearly, Amsterdam, agglomeration issues, Spain, yeah, but also lots of these sort of lifestyle places. Yeah. Is that a pattern that doesn't occur in the Netherlands? Are there lifestyle places in the Netherlands, or am I misrepresenting the maps and that they're not really an expression of the capitalisation of the value of amenity and access to jobs?
Yeah, no, you're not. You're characterizing it correctly. That those areas that saw the highest growth rates were areas that are also more desirable for different reasons. And one in the Netherlands, those are large cities like Amsterdam, but some other cities that didn't see as much increase, such as Rotterdam. So if you're familiar, that's one that didn't see as much growth. But also we saw it in kind of secondary student university cities as well. So they're all locales of kind of investment. Now, simply put, it sounded like part of your question was, are there tourist zones in the Netherlands where people are investing in? Not much. Those Dutch people are investing in the south of Spain too, probably, to some extent. So, yeah. So in the case of Spain, it's really big cities which is kind of the prime location of investment. And so all these things are interacting of households, individual households investing in these areas that have the financial capacity, as well, of course, as institutional investors and flows of larger kind of capital into these areas that are driving that. So these go together. In the Spanish case, there's also touristification. So that's kind of the extra dimension there. So my answer is yes, amenities matter. So there's already kind of the uneven landscape of what is more desirable and less desirable, but these large flows of capital into housing have intensified those divides, if that helps answer it.
Over here, please.
Thank you. Under the category of some homeowners are more equal than other homeowners, I guess a follow-on question really. I'm thinking about the way amenity, I mean, it's often stated in Australia, and I presume it would be the same in Western Europe, that the more affluent you are, the longer you live because you can access better healthcare services and so on. Have you looked at, in your research, at the relationship between these more affluent areas and not just things like universities, but also healthcare and other public amenities, I guess? So are public amenities following the wealth?
So it's an easy answer because I haven't looked at it, but it's a very interesting question. So I'm not going to pretend I have. But in that kind of second part that I glossed over, which was explaining spatial inequality, and I'm trying to look at different micro level and kind of macro level variables that might explain the increasing divergence. And part of that is trying to understand elements of what are the correlation, what type of areas have seen the most accumulation, also linking it with flows of investment capital. But I haven't thought of what you're mentioning. That's always great to get something that you haven't thought of, and that is thinking about things like healthcare access and healthcare service. So we know, of course, the cities have better access, but I don't know if there's a more detailed correlation between quality of access. So interesting point.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. Maybe a way of taking the research further, who knows?
Yeah.
Okay, over here, please. Sorry.
Yep.
Just a question about the concept of when a young person's entering a market, they won't be able to afford the most expensive areas, but they might then move one step out. Mm-hmm. And then that area in time increases in value. And if that is really a factor that's happening, then you would expect that the pattern of what you've seen to, over time, it would be like a mould on a petri dish, where the mould will grow bigger rather than more sporadic elements popping up randomly. Mm-hmm. And do you think that's what you see?
Yeah, that very good question. The other analogies have been used, like an ink blot or something, the idea of the spillover effects of, kind of a high value area then spilling over. So yes, we see a little bit of that happens. But I think a lot of research has focused on kind of city level dynamics. So there's been a lot of work on kind of gentrification in certain neighborhoods where they flow into certain areas that are, changing or increasing inequality. And of course, when we're working in the city, we have to think about what's happening there. But the goal of this one was to take a step back and understand, but how does that come out in the wash at the macro level, at the level of the country, what's happening? So at the level of individual neighborhoods, you can see neighborhoods that were undervalued that increased in value, and maybe in a small region that could have reduced a slight amount of spatial inequality, right? Could have balanced something out with a neighboring area. But if you zoom out a little bit and look at the full national territory, what we see is clearly, overall, it's just intensifying spatial inequality. So it's a bit of a complicated answer, but I'm trying to say is that right around the edges of high value areas, we probably see that spillover effect that might actually reduce in a very local level some of the spatial inequality. That's possible. But if we zoom out, overall, we see it increasing. And we were also able to look at, just within cities, So in the Dutch and Spanish case, we looked at the top 40 largest cities, because you need to have cities that are big enough that they had enough neighborhood units within them to understand. And there, almost every, so out of the, I don't remember the Netherlands, there might have been 3 cities that didn't see increasing inequality. Every other one did. And in the Spanish case, similar. So even at the level of cities, we see increasing inequality. So with the complexity of all those dynamics that are happening, gentrification, increasing certain values, overall, the pattern has still been increasing inequality.
Thank you. Let's stay on this side of the room. Just here in the front, thanks.
I'm interested in just spatially in terms of, I mean, clearly wealth is concentrated and wealthy people like to live in particular places. And I'm just wondering to what extent the progeny of those people are actually looking for places to live in the same area that they are, and then that, in a sense, fuels that wealth growth. And I'm just wondering whether you've looked at any of those sort of spatial changes, because I know in other areas, people that grow up in poorer areas tend to buy also in those areas for a number of different reasons if they can as well. So I'm just wondering how that feeds into the outcomes that you're looking at.
Yeah, that's a very good element to think about, kind of how is it intergenerational, how does that happen? And the answer is, yeah, we do know from other research that children tend to stay on average, close to where they were from, which is not surprising. Either in the same neighborhood or close to it, or might try to return to it on average. So yeah, that is happening. And that is part of the kind of story when we think of the mechanism of the unequal housing market becoming more unequal, combining with those flows of people. And those flows of people are connected in terms of, so where you can afford the type of income you have, but it's also going to be your kind of, we could call it more the socio-cultural outlook of where you want to live, what you were used to. And those combining elements mean that we see an increasing separation. Now, if the housing market, this is hypothetical, doesn't exist, the housing market was completely flat, then it wouldn't matter where you were going. You could stay in a certain area. But we see that those that have the advantage of having parents from areas that are higher gain kind of prime markets can stay there or close to it in similarly quite high gain areas. So they're combining together.
Another question just behind there.
To what extent would you expect to see the kinds of graphs you were showing simply as a result of like the agglomeration effects in cities? So the intensification of productivity and wealth building in a city over time. And where does it diverge from that, and why do you think it does?
So this is getting again into kind of part 2 of trying to explain it. So yes, probably most of those reasons I would say yes are part of the impact. And I would just say, so that's kind of the discussion of uneven development. It's not just, some of it's natural economic agglomeration effects, and some of it's active policies prioritizing growth, burgeoning areas. Now my argument would be, yeah, that's happening, and we have to think about what does that mean in terms of the mechanism of sorting housing wealth growth. And that's sometimes forgotten. We just think of it as kind of, it's an advantage of an economic concentration, but actually you're taking away potential economic growth in other places. We have to just consider the costs of that. And also within the housing market, it's just intensifying this division in wealth accumulation. So yeah.
Thanks. Don't you want to come and study the Australian example? This culture also has a lot to do. I don't mean black and white culture, but I was living in Europe in the 70s, 80s. I'm an old codger. Nobody over there talks very much about ownership. Whereas here, when you come, I don't know whether you're familiar, the Australian dream, the quarter-acre block, you know, the old people talk about, now is a dream. I remember when I had a job here, it was easy to buy a second property. If 50,000 go to the bank, they'll give you $500,000 loan, very, very easy. Now it's next to impossible. And also with migrants coming in, the Asian would tell their kids, don't worry, just buy one, irrespective of what suburbs you are. The other comment, what do you have? You talked about different areas. Like if you look, I don't know how familiar you are with Sydney. If you look at Paddington, Surrey Hills, Redfern. These are poor areas in the 70s. Now you got no chance in buying into Surrey Hills. What do you think are some of the differences?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I mean, the first point is there are a lot of differences across countries. Definitely in the 70s, more extreme differences between Europe and Australia, which was already very much a homeowner society, but many European countries weren't. But what we have seen over several decades across Europe is the rise of homeownership in most places. So there are still strong differences. I was talking before about Germany and some other countries that are still, Switzerland, Austria, that are still majority or roughly around half-half renter and homeownership, so they have low homeownership. But even in those places, we see trends heading in the same direction as Australia. So I could say that a lot of countries have different kind of starting points, different kind of baselines, different specific characteristics, but most of them are heading in the same direction of that. And in terms of the specific neighborhoods, yeah, I know some of those areas. What we're talking about dynamics that also happen in many countries of cities seeing really concentration of wealth, incomes flowing back into cities to some extent, or newly into cities into other areas in process of gentrification. Of course, I'm only looking here at like a 10 to 12 year period. I would love to be able to analyze this over 100 years. The problem is I can't travel back in time and I don't have the data. So it is hard to get that data to be able to look at what are the dynamics overall. But we can see over this decade increasing inequality. And that's happening within cities and across the territories of these country cases.
Thank you. Some more questions here?
Thank you very much for that very interesting talk. We have a bit of a double whammy in Sydney, I think, in the fact that we have the spatial segregation or wealth distribution, but we're also now, because we started, as that gentleman said, really with detached houses on blocks of land, a huge disparity in the type of housing. So whilst it's fine now and you can waltz in and buy an apartment, the lower end of the market would buy an apartment in a less desirable area, but also the building stock. We have no actual method of maintaining the building stock, of organising the people within the building stock, and particularly the maintenance. So come 20 or 30 years' time, you've actually got not only the poor spatial distribution, but you've got the problem of the actual housing stock. So I don't know if that's different in Europe or...
It's an issue, of course, different specific characteristics of the building stock, but an issue of Europe as well has a huge share of older buildings, unsurprisingly, definitely in the Netherlands, and a lot of problems of how to retrofit them for energy consumption, for climate change, more intense heat spikes, storms, these kind of things, or how to retrofit them. So that's a whole other issue that becomes difficult. I guess I would tie it into just kind of a broader story, because I can't speak too much about that, but just the broader message being that, yeah, we've created a system where you have individuals buying houses and becoming very independently, they're expected to be independently self-sufficient, and that involves a whole series of issues. So they might have really struggled to enter on what some have referred to as the margins of homeownership or the edge of homeownership, entering in a difficult way, and also facing a house that has a lot of problems that they are expected to maintain themselves. So you have to think about that whole system. How functional is it to rely on individuals to manage these assets? And again, are these assets a functional way of distributing wealth across a society? So that's a very big picture answer to your question. But the argument here is that, yet again, there's another way of showing how housing fails as a mechanism to redistribute housing wealth. So you can park your value in your house. Maybe it'll accrue a huge amount. For some people it did, and for other people it might just stagnate or fall. And again, we forget about this extra dimension which I'm trying to bring in there, which is space. Space matters so much. At the scale of the national territory, most people living in Sydney are doing better off than other places. So there's all these different levels of scale of where you're doing that in terms of this, in terms of value growth. But there are areas in Sydney doing way better than other areas. But the general message I'd like to kind of convey is that it's another example of how it's a dysfunctional system. We think of kind of this system of asset-based welfare or wealth accumulation. Clearly, there's many reasons why there's unequal access already, but even if you get access to housing, you have such differentiated potential pathways of wealth accumulation. And the indications of all these dynamics is that they're just intensifying those divides. That once you put all that money into the housing market is just acting as an engine, particularly in how it functions spatially in intensifying those divides, so an extra engine of inequality. And what do we need to think about? We need to think about ways of tempering the role of housing as simply an investment or speculative asset accumulation. We think of it more in terms of housing as a good, as a shelter, and we could think of also sharing not only the wealth, but also the maintenance, for example, of how to deal with that not everything is individualized because you've entered the lottery and it's your place to either gain or lose from.